In a development that could reshape relations across Latin America and beyond, sources say that certain figures within the Cuban government have initiated discreet contact with US officials to discuss what the region might look like without Nicolás Maduro in power, a move that marks a striking departure from Cuba's loudly defiant public stance toward Washington. Though unnamed by sources, the outreach reportedly involved elements within the Cuban regime who opened channels of communication to explore potential scenarios following a Maduro exit. Elements within the Cuban regime reached out to the US. One source briefed on the contact said there have been discussions about what the world would look like without a Maduro regime. That such talks are occurring confidentially, cautiously, behind the scenes underscores the growing concern in Havana over mounting pressure on Caracas. And it raises profound questions about the future role of Cuba in a region on the edge of political upheaval. To grasp the importance of the alleged outreach, it helps to rewind just a few weeks when the public tone of Cuba was markedly different. On November 25, the government issued a blistering condemnation of recent US military deployments in the Caribbean and what it described as a looming plan for violent regime change in Venezuela. In no uncertain terms, Cuba called the US actions exaggerated and aggressive, warning that they threaten to unleash a scenario of violence and instability in the hemisphere. At the time, Cuba's Foreign Minister Bruno Rodriguez Perea, publicly the face of Havana's defiance, argued that any attempt to overthrow the Venezuelan government would breach international law and breach the Charter of the United Nations. He appealed directly to the American public, urging them to reject what he called warmongering. Given such fiery rhetoric, the recent secret contacts reveal a major recalibration behind closed doors, a signal, perhaps, that the calculus in Havana is rapidly shifting. Observers say the factors pushing Cuba toward this discreet diplomacy are multiple: escalating US pressure on Venezuela, economic distress in Cuba, uncertainty over continued subsidies from Caracas, and a sense among some Cuban insiders that an eventual change in Venezuela is no longer hypothetical, but likely. In recent months, the US, under Donald J. Trump, has significantly intensified its campaign against Maduro's government. The measures include a robust naval deployment in the Caribbean, coordinated air and maritime strikes on vessels accused of drug trafficking, sanctions, and the formal designation of the Venezuelan narco organization Cartel of the Suns as a foreign terrorist group. According to the publicly compiled timeline, the deployment and counter-drug campaign, viewed by Caracas as a thinly veiled strategy for regime change, escalated throughout 2025, culminating in lethal strikes on alleged smuggling vessels. NYT and other media outlets have described how during ongoing diplomatic overtures, Maduro's aides reportedly proposed giving the US broad access to Venezuela's oil and gold ventures, part of what some sources described as a sellout to avert war. That proposal, however, was ultimately rejected by US officials. Such developments have added pressure not only on Caracas, but also on Havana, which hosted Venezuelan oil shipments and had long benefited from subsidized energy exports, a cornerstone of the Cuba-Venezuela alliance. Cuba's economic and infrastructural crisis has deepened in recent years. With diminished Venezuelan oil support and chronic shortages, the island is under growing stress. Analysts say that if Maduro falls, Cuba risks losing what remains of its lifeline, which may compel some Cuban officials to consider contingency plans to secure economic breathing room. In that light, behind-the-scenes outreach to the US could be motivated by a pragmatic calculus, safeguarding Cuba's long-term interests in a rapidly shifting regional order. Cuba has repeatedly warned that military intervention or regime collapse in Venezuela could trigger chaos, massive migration flows, and wider instability across Latin America. By initiating back-channel contacts, some inside Havana may be seeking a way to influence, or at least anticipate, the aftermath, potentially preserving leverage and avoiding being caught off guard by an abrupt power shift in Caracas. While the reported contacts have stirred global attention, many key details remain uncertain, underscoring just how sensitive and speculative this development is. Who exactly in Cuba initiated the talks remains unknown. According to media reports, the sources declined to identify who specifically from Cuba contacted the US. The substance of the conversations is likewise vague. Some sources say the talks focused on mapping out a post-Maduro scenario, what would happen to institutions, governance, economic ties, and regional stability. Whether Washington responded positively, negatively, or with silence is not clear. As of now, there is no public record of follow-up or confirmation from US officials. That ambiguity is by design for Havana and likely for the US. Deniability is part of the strategy. Publicly taking such a risk could provoke blowback in Cuba, regionally and internationally. Privately exploring contingency plans is, however, a different political calculus. Despite mounting US pressure and the apparent overtures from Havana, Nicolás Maduro remains publicly defiant. The Maduro administration has portrayed the US naval deployment and series of strikes on alleged drug smuggling vessels as an existential threat, a prelude to forced regime change aimed at wresting control of Venezuela's rich oil and mineral wealth. In a recent call with President Trump, confirmed by both sides, Maduro reportedly expressed willingness to step down in return for legal amnesty, removal of sanctions, and the dismissal of an ongoing flagship case in the International Criminal Court. But while that gesture hinted at possible negotiation, Maduro has so far refused to relinquish power or accept conditions that would undermine his control of Venezuela's military apparatus. According to regional media, Maduro and his inner circle believe they can wait out the US pressure campaign. In public speeches, Maduro continues to portray his government as a bulwark against US imperialism and a defender of national sovereignty. We do not want a slave's peace, nor the peace of colonies, he said at a recent rally, reiterating his defiance. At the heart of this story is a high-stakes gamble, whether Cuba, long a staunch ally of Venezuela, might quietly shift course if the regional winds change. The reported contacts between Havana and Washington could herald one of the most significant geopolitical realignments in Latin America in decades. If Havana is indeed quietly hedging, this could mark a turning point. Cuba may be positioning itself for a post-Maduro order in which it renegotiates its economic and diplomatic alignment, possibly preserving benefits or securing new arrangements with the US or other regional powers. Such a pivot could reshape decades-old alliances, ending or substantially transforming the bilateral solidarity between Cuba and Venezuela. It may also signal to other nations in Latin America, many already wary of US intervention, that realignment is possible even under old ideological banners. For Venezuela, the reach out from Cuba, even if partial, may undermine continuity, morale and cohesion among its allies. If Cuba vacillates, other nations or factions may sense an opening. The Maduro government, despite its defiance, could find internal cracks widening. Moreover, lack of a firm Cuban guarantee might embolden opposition groups or outside pressure. That could create a vacuum of influence, possibly triggering power struggles, social unrest, or expedited negotiations for transition. A sudden collapse of the Venezuelan regime combined with shifting Cuban policies could destabilize the broader region. Migration flows, disruption of oil markets, political realignments, and expanded influence of external powers, economic or strategic, are all on the table. On the other hand, if the outreach leads to careful diplomacy, with Cuba acting as a mediator or broker, there may be a chance for a relatively controlled transition. Cuba's geopolitical weight, for decades rooted in ideological solidarity, could instead become a fulcrum for a negotiated outcome. The significance of this development extends well beyond regional borders. For global powers, energy markets, international security, and geopolitical alignment, a shift in the Cuba-Venezuela relationship would have ripple effects. Oil markets and global energy. Venezuela remains home to some of the world's largest oil reserves. A post-Maduro Venezuela, possibly opening to foreign investment or restructuring, could reshape supply dynamics. Cuba, suffering economic decline, may seek to reorient toward new partners or arrangements. Geopolitics and influence for the US. A successful recalibration of Cuba's posture would mark a strategic victory, denting a decades-old alliance that served as a regional counterweight. For other powers, European, Latin American, or otherwise, this would recalibrate diplomatic opportunities and alignments. International norms and intervention. The entire episode compels countries to re-examine norms around intervention, sovereignty, and the legitimacy of secret diplomacy. If the US and Cuba quietly negotiate over regime outcomes, it may set new precedents for how global influence is exercised. Humanitarian and migration concerns. A collapse of the Venezuelan state or a poorly managed transition could spark significant migration. Cuba itself faces waves of emigration. Combined, such shifts could overwhelm neighboring countries and create new humanitarian crises. Given how fluid the situation remains, there are several key developments to monitor in the coming days and weeks. Whether the alleged contacts between Havana and Washington lead to formal negotiations or remain a speculative, discreet back-channel experiment. Public statements from Cuban officials, especially from Foreign Minister Bruno Rodriguez, that could signal a softening of Cuba's public posture. Internal signals from Caracas, whether Maduro remains defiant, offers new concessions, or begins to reorganize power structures. Reactions from regional actors, neighbors, other Latin American governments and international institutions. Will they support stability, mediate, or attempt to shape the transition themselves? Economic indicators, shifts in oil trade, foreign investments, sanctions, remittances, and the flows of goods and resources that bind the region. The reported initiative by unnamed Cuban regime elements to quietly test the waters with US officials marks a daring act of recalculation, one that underscores how high the stakes have become. For years, the Cuba-Venezuela alliance stood as a symbol of resistance, ideological, economic, and geopolitical. It underpinned a shared vision of sovereignty against foreign interference and grounded decades of cooperation. Yet now, with rising tensions, economic collapse, and shifting sands of power, that once solid alliance may be showing cracks. And whether those cracks widen into full-blown fracture or simply evolve into a more pragmatic, transactional relationship depends on choices made behind closed doors in Havana, Washington, Caracas, and across Latin America. At this moment, silence from Havana may speak louder than its past declarations. History may one day mark this moment as the beginning of a quiet but profound realignment, or perhaps as an aborted bid for contingency that never resulted in change. At the very least, the mere fact that Cuba is now entertaining what a post-Maduro world might look like by reaching out to the US reveals how precarious the status quo has become. And with pressure mounting in Washington, uncertainty growing in Caracas, and anxiety rising in Havana, the region stands at a crossroads. The consequences of whichever path is chosen, negotiation, regime collapse, or managed transition, will not remain confined within Venezuela's borders. For now, the world waits, eyes on the Caribbean.